The size of the state will be a central battleground of this year's general election. The Conservatives want to cut the public deficit from about £90 billion this year to a surplus of £20 billion in 2020. That implies public spending cuts bigger than over the past 5 years. Labour want to cut much less, by about £40 billion a year less, and they say the Conservative plans are driven more by ideology than pragmatism. In fact, they make a very specific claim. They claim that the Tories' plans for public spending imply cutting the public services back to the levels of the 1930s when there was no NHS. That's a very big claim. Is it true? And more importantly, is it fair? On a specific level, the claim's true. Total public spending as a share of national income is scheduled to fall to about 35%, a level last seen in 1938. But 1938 wasn't at all representative of the 1930s in general, because Britain was already rearming for war. Generally in the 30s, public spending was around 25% of national income, far lower than scheduled to be in 2020. And in fact, economic historians say the 1930s is a rather odd decade to choose for comparisons, because it's a sort of halfway house between the minimalist Victorian state, where public spending really was just about preparing for war and fighting wars, and the post-Second World War state, which did health, education, pensions and much more. Over the past 150 years, there have been many specific moments where the size of the state has been radically altered. In 1908, the Liberal government with Chancellor Lloyd George introduced initial pensions, healthcare and unemployment insurance. In 1942, the Beveridge Report attacked the giant evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness. In the 1960s, higher education was expanded greatly. But then in the 1980s, the Thatcher government rolled back the frontiers of the state. And that was a settlement until 2000s, when the Labour government initially accepted it, but then wanted to spend more on health, education and in-work benefits. Fighting wars is an incredibly expensive business, accounting for most of government spending in the First World War and the Second World War, with big legacy costs thereafter. But it's not the only burden, because of the money needed to borrow to finance those wars leaves a great debt burden. In the 1930s, the government spent about a quarter of its spending on debt interest. That's fallen massively to less than 10% today. Health spending has been the big winner over the past 100 years, accounting for about 3% of public spending in the 1920s, 7% in the 1930s, and after the National Health Service was founded in 1948, a steadily rising share until it's almost hitting 20% today. And the pressures are still rising, coming from new technology, an ageing population, and the fact that as we get richer as a society, we demand more healthcare. Education was something of a Cinderella public service until the Butler Act in 1944, and then spending grew from about 7% of total public spending to almost 15% by the 1970s. The money was spent on expanding the education sector, so the school leaving age was raised to 16 in the 1970s, and there was a huge increase in university education. More recently, pressures on spending have been contained somewhat by forcing students to pay for more of their own education. But the pressures are still there, partly because education governs Britain's future, and partly because standards in education have been slipping behind some of Britain's major industrialised competitors. Social security payments are cyclical, with big rises in the proportion of total public spending in the recessions of the 1930s, 70s, 80s, 90s and even after 2008. But it's not just cyclical pressure on spending that matters. About half of social security spending comes from pensioners, and this is where the big pressure will rise in the years ahead when the baby boomers retire. So is the size of the state heading back to the levels of the 1930s? No, it's more like the 1950s. But if the planned cuts to public spending over the next 5 years go ahead, the pressures on public services will be intense. Chris Giles, Financial Times, London.